All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this Kendall Hunt webinar, Using Critical Questioning to Improve Informational Text Comprehension. In this webinar, we will be going over how to purposely craft questions with the goal of assisting college preparatory and incoming college students with the necessary text negotiation and thinking strategies. Before we begin, just to go over some housekeeping points, this webinar will be recorded and you guys will be receiving access in the coming days as well as our presenters' contact information. Please feel free to ask questions and comment throughout the webinar using the chat and Q&A functions at the end, we'll be saving time to answer everything. Now to introduce our speakers. Dr. Sharon Russell is the Reading and Literacy Program Director, as well as Assistant Professor of Literacy at Ashland University. She is also the creator, author, and founder of the Adolescents Critical Reading Intervention Model in use across the state of Michigan. Jolene Scott Roller has been teaching writing across levels for 14 years, holding a BA, MA, and MFA in writing. Her textbook, First Things First, is used at the Ashland University Correctional Education Program, one of the largest in the country. Now I'm going to turn it over to our presenters.
Thanks, Bailey. Welcome, everybody. As Bailey said, we are going to be going over using critical questioning to improve informational text comprehension, which sounds very fancy. Using critical questions to bridge readers and text. And this is based on the program that Sharon developed and the textbook that she and I wrote together, which we will talk more about towards the end of the presentation. The idea here really is about developing strategies for helping our students to bridge what they're reading to what they're thinking. So to start, we can go to the next slide.
Yes, unfortunately, for whatever reason, I'm having trouble going to the next slide. So my apologies. I think that I will first try this again.
Technical difficulties. We did practice this before we started, I promise.
It was working.
It was working.
But now nothing is working. Not my mouse, not my arrow keys. My apologies. All right. I am wondering. I need to complete.
Let me see.
Julian, do you have
I was just checking to see, do I have the updated one? I think I do. I just have to find it. Nope, that's not it. I'm sorry, everybody.
Now it's working. I just had to go out and come back in. So
okay.
my apologies. We'll start, Jolene, with the second slide.
Okay. Okay. So first of all, starting at the beginning of all things, identifying what the problem is. In my experience of teaching various levels of composition, and I teach developmental at open enrollment universities, so sometimes as low as English 89, to competent writers in creative writing classes and higher level literature classes, I noticed a trend, and this is over 14 years of teaching. The trend has changed somewhat, but held steady, that students don't know how to read the nonfiction that I assigned them. When I assign narrative, they seem to do okay. But as soon as we shift into something nonfiction, they get a little bit lost. And I found myself having to slow classes down to help them puzzle through what they missed between the lines, which meant that we made slower or less progress than I would have preferred. And then Sharon, do you want to talk about your experience?
Sure. So I spent over 20 years working with students K-12, but my area of specialization is expository text and adolescent struggling readers. And what we've discovered is there is a gap in reading support and reading instruction that starts from the very beginning of school. We do not spend enough time directly teaching children to read a nonfiction text. Because of that, when they get into disciplinary literacy, they don't have the foundations to build upon. And there seems to be an unwritten expectation that narrative skills are going to transfer to nonfiction text, and they simply do not. Nonfiction requires a whole set of different cognitive skills.
Yeah. So then on the next slide, we have what Sharon just said is that the problem is it doesn't work. The skills needed to navigate nonfiction, especially informational text, are different than those that you use to read a story. Our brain interprets those things differently. And without intentional instruction on how to navigate textbooks, for example, students often don't develop the skills they need to fully comprehend informational writing. So what we're talking about here is that when students move from, say, lower elementary to higher elementary, junior high, high school, especially, they haven't made any kind of transition from understanding narration to understanding informational text. They haven't been given the skills on purpose to do that. So then we get them in higher education in college, and they've gotten through high school okay, maybe, but then they come to us and we have far more complicated, complex texts for them to interpret, and they have trouble doing that because they haven't been taught how to do that. So I think that it makes sense to anyone that if a person has not been taught how to do something, it's somewhat unreasonable to expect them to be able to do it. So if you think about how we teach reading in lower grades, think about what kind of texts schools use to teach reading. Maybe think about what kind of books you learned to read with. I know for me, it was Tiger is a Scaredy Cat, which was a narrative, and then Ramona books. You know, I think about what makes up the bulk of students reading in elementary school. Maybe if you have children, what kind of books did your kids learn to read with? And then when we start to think about what makes up the bulk of student reading in secondary school, it's a lot less narrative and a lot more history textbook, biology textbook, and that sort of thing. And then moving even farther forward, what do students have to read in college? Unless they're specifically taking a literature class, they're not reading a lot of narrative. And even if they are taking a literature class, there's still a lot of nonfiction informational text to read. I know that in my literature classes, I require students to do research in journals and magazines that are examining literature and examining narrative, but the texts themselves are not narrative. So when you get to college, there's There's almost no narrative to read at all. So I think it's easy to see the disconnect there. Negotiating exposition requires a completely different set of cognitive skills from the comprehension of narrative fiction. So students simply don't know how to think with nonfiction text. And they typically don't understand that these processes are actually different, and neither do parents. So the disconnection is often not caught. If you have a student who's been identified as a struggling reader in later grades, a lot of people don't stop to think, well, this is probably just because they didn't catch on by themselves how to read nonfiction. They haven't been taught how to read nonfiction. So we're going to do a little exercise. I want you to look at these two books. Think about what do you know about each of these books just by looking at them. Think about what elements each will have. What kinds of things do you expect to find inside of them? Why would you likely be to read each one of them? When would you likely read it? And think about too, how do you know when you're reading narrative versus when you're reading nonfiction? So some of what we're going to talk about today is the difference between knowing and inferring. What you know about the books is that James Patterson is the author of the first one. He's known for writing thriller stories, if you are familiar with his name at all. The title is The Summer House because it's written there on the front. The other book is about biology because it says so on the front. And you will theoretically know that biology is a science. What you can infer is that the summer house will probably be organized into chapters, and you're meant to read them in order. You probably are inferring that the summer house will be narrative fiction because James Patterson is known for reading narrative fiction. The biology book is a textbook. Again, you're inferring that from the information that you have from just the front cover. And what you know or have background information about textbooks is that it may be organized into chapters and subchapters. It will likely have a table of contents and a glossary. There will likely be graphs and pictures. So there's a lot of information that you are inferring from your background knowledge that you're bringing to the book without having actually opened it. But many people don't realize that they're doing this. A lot of people don't know that they're bringing their own background knowledge to a text, which then enables them to make accurate inferences. Many young or struggling readers don't have the background knowledge to bring. They therefore aren't making accurate inferences or aren't making any inferences at all, which then creates difficulties in comprehension, as most competent writers are going to assume that the readers will bring that background knowledge and be able to make accurate inferences. So there's an interaction here between competent writers' expectations of their audience, and then competent and non-competent, or not non-competent, but struggling readers who may or may not have that background knowledge. So Sharon is now going to take over talking about what we do about this problem and how we solve it.
Yeah, so I want to talk about bringing together cognitive strategies and critical questioning. The cognitive strategies that readers need for nonfiction and true exposition are to be able to make inferences across details, across paragraphs, to be able to uncover the author's underlying message, not only to find and infer connections within text, but also across text, identify the claim or main idea, and determine how the most important information fits that claim. And to do so, they also have to be able to identify organizational structure. What we try to help students do is create cognitive bridges by asking really well-structured critical questions. So why questioning? I can tell you what the answer is, and I can tell my students what the answer is, but that doesn't help their thinking. And they may not automatically see how I got to the answer because it's my thinking and not theirs. Many of the strategies we use rely on trying to give students adult or proficient thinking. Instead, we need to help them build their own thinking. And one of the ways that we can do that is through really well thought out questions. So how do we do that? Part of it is really understanding your text. We identify comprehension roadblocks in the text and use those to create text-based critical comprehension questions. So identifying comprehension roadblocks is our first step. What do I mean by a comprehension roadblock? Authors repeatedly commit things I call assumacides. They leave out information that they believe to be obvious. And it is this obvious information that students who struggle don't get. So when you were looking at the example of the biology book, the obvious information is that it is going to be organized by chapters in biology, and each chapter will have headings and subheadings and certain features. If we help students find those breakdowns, we can help them think critically for themselves around those comprehension roadblocks. So the steps in the process are to find the roadblocks in the text. Then we identify what part of the text. Is it a detail problem? Is it an author's pattern or text structure problem? Or is it a layout problem with text features? And we match it to one of 3 question types. And we will be looking at each of these 3 question types separately, but as a quick overview, each one of them has a research base in helping students gain informational text comprehension proficiency. The first one is question-answer relationships. And I like to use these when inference is required across 2 or more discrete details at the sentence or paragraph level. The second is text structure questions. And text structures and authors' patterns like cause and effect, compare and contrast, argument structure, etc. Also, main ideas, topic sentences, and claims are directly tied to the author's chosen text structure. And the third type is questioning the author. You can use questioning the author brings the author to the table. You can use these anytime you want to create a discussion or a debate about an author's decision. Like, why did the author choose to give me a particular chart or graph? I like to use questioning the author to focus on layout, maps, charts, photos, headings, those types of text features. So we're going to look at an example of each question type. question-answer relationship, a text structure question, and then a questioning the author. We have deliberately chosen a really simple piece of text to illustrate for you how these questions work. We encourage you to participate via the chat, and you should have a handout in case you want to take notes or write things down that accompany these questioning slides. So we're going to start with question-answer relationships that help us with inferences across 2 or more details. So let's try it, and I will wait a few minutes before I jump back in because I'm hopeful that you will put answers in the chat. So read the 2 sentences and then answer the question. What's the relationship between Carol and Mom? No takers? Ah, okay.
We have a few answers here. Carol is the daughter. And another comment, they have a parental-child relationship.
Thank you very much for being brave enough to work on answering that question. So let's, oh shoot. If I'm not clicked in, it doesn't. What were you thinking? Let's think about what you can and can't infer. You can infer that she is the pronoun referring to Carol. I have another chat. Oh, Carol might be the caregiver. Okay. Carol somehow got to the store. We know that because Mom sent her. She bought bread, which means she got to a store, one that typically sells bread. She used some sort of currency to buy the bread because it says so. She didn't steal it. Mom needed bread for some reason. And we can infer that Carol took it home to Mom. What we cannot infer is why Mom needed bread, how old Carol is, how she got to the store, or that Carol is Mom's daughter. There's not enough information in the passage. So earlier when Jolene was talking about background knowledge and what you bring to a text, and accurate and inaccurate inferences, this is exactly how that plays out.
And I think it's important to notice too that with a very young reader or a reader who's struggling maybe as an ESL student, they may not even be able to infer that, for example, Carol used some sort of currency to buy bread. We know as competent readers that the word bought does mean that she did not steal the bread, that she used some kind of money to buy bread. But an ESL student, for example, may not make that inference even.
And these are very simple examples. But what happens with disciplinary text is people who are experts in their discipline don't realize the connections that students aren't making, or when they're over predicting something that they can't. So the details I need to answer this question is that Carol and Mom are occupying the same space. It's Carol who goes to the store, and I know that because she stands for Carol. If Mom hadn't needed bread, Carol wouldn't have gone. She didn't go to Midas. She went to a store that typically sells bread, used some sort of currency, and took the bread to Mom. So the answer is that the relationship between Carol and Mom is that Mom asked Carol to go buy bread at the store and return with the bread so Mom could use it. Those are the inferences I need to make from the text. The background knowledge that students may bring could be incorrect because they're superimposing something that may not be accurate. So this is on your handout. So the question type is there on the left. Inferential questions, suggestions for using it. Question starters. I find that when I do professional development, my instructors like to have question starters. So how does something work? What's important about X? What's the relationship between Mom and Carol? What's important about the store? So what is happening here? I did say a bunch of this, but you are a proficient reader and an expert reader in your discipline. So your proficient brain automatically fills in the gaps. If you didn't find those little suicides like she stands for Carol, it's because you're proficient with exposition and those inferences did not even occur to you. Your brain just did it for you. So that's the difference between you and your student readers. Your student readers are still learning to read in your discipline and lack the same disciplinary proficiencies that you have. We cannot assume that readers who are developing expertise are going to make the same connection. And they may make incorrect connections. So now I'd like to try a text structure question. These help with text structures like compare and contrast, cause and effect, timelines. They all authors, what ELA textbooks often call authors' organizational patterns, like a location pattern for how to get to the Taj Mahal. They also help with identifying claim, main idea, or at the paragraph level topic sentence. And identifying structural organization really helps with uncovering the author's purpose. So I'm going to give you longer time because this is a little bit more of the Carol story. So go ahead and read the Carol story. And my text structure question is, how do these details work together?
So we have context, understanding the relationship among the narrator, a character, Mom and Carol. Carol is a friend of Mom's daughter, assuming the narrator is not misleading us.
Yes, so you do have to assume that's the narrator is telling the story and that somehow that person is connected to mom. Oh, I'm clicked out again. Is that a new one?
The details explain the events showing the relationship between Mom and Carol. In this case, Carol is the friend of the child from college. Then we have a question. Do we know that Mom's child is a daughter? Good question.
Yes, the details do explain events. Can you infer from this paragraph that mom's child is a daughter? I would say that you don't have enough text-based evidence to infer that. You are making an assumption from your background knowledge. It may or may not be accurate. Thank you. So, oh, clicking. Did I go backwards? My apologies. So how do these details work together? You are on target with that one. There are events in order, like a timeline. Carol went along on Sunday because she came home for the weekend. When they were at the soup kitchen, they discovered they might run out of bread. It would have been hard for a volunteer to go. So mom sent Carol. And there are some details that are ancillary and important, but not necessarily sequential. We have to understand that Carol came home, the Carol's there because she came home with mom's child from college, and that they didn't need more volunteers, which is why Carol wasn't in the soup kitchen line. But there's more. So some events and details require inference. Event 1. Carol went along on Sunday because she came home for the weekend. These two details need to be combined, and we have to infer that the person who brought Carol's home is mom's child, but you cannot infer gender. So good catch, whoever that was. Event 2, we discovered we might run out of bread. Well, so we can infer that bread was being used in the serving line, and there wasn't enough for everyone who needed to eat. Event 3, it would have been hard for a volunteer to go because that would have messed up the serving line and caused confusion. Because Carol wasn't serving, it was easier for Carol to leave the soup kitchen, so mom sent Carol. Did you notice that all of the inferences in red began with the word because? This text is not just a timeline or a linear. It also is causal sequential because every cause must be inferred. And that is a difficulty students at all levels have trouble with, the inference between the cause and the effect. Mom sent Carol because she wasn't serving. So the cause is that Carol wasn't serving. Effect 1, it was easier for her to leave. Effect 2, mom sent Carol. So what's happening here? Text structures are always inferred. Authors don't say, I'm going to write you a timeline about Carol going to the soup kitchen, or I'm going to write you a compare and contrast between whales and fish. It would be silly. Your proficient brain automatically identifies structure and you look for it, but you don't have to think about it. It just runs in the background while you're reading. The time it comes into play is when an author goes off track and you're like, what? How does that fit in? And then you're looking for a new structure or how to get that. So the difference between you and your student readers. Again, we can't assume that your student readers who are developing expertise will make the same connections. They may not be able to identify or infer structural patterns. That is really difficult for readers who do not understand how text works. Focusing on text structure is one of the most powerful things you can help your students with. Because they can't identify structure, they don't understand the author's purpose or how the details work together, so they're not going to get to the claim or the real meat of what you're trying to get them to understand. Here is the text structure example on your handout. A list of question starters. Is there something special about these details? Does the author give us a good claim? What is the main idea sentence? What is the author arguing? Lots of ways you can do it. And examples from the slideshow. How do these details work together? Or another one I could ask and get the same result is, why did the author choose this structure? Which would force students to start looking for the structure in order to pull out how the details work.
And I think it's worth noting too that even though this is informational, there's still a sense of narrative in that example, that because we're trying to show this with a simple example, we're talking still with narrative. If you're trying to do this with a biology textbook, then you might have to tweak some of those thoughts about the structure. I think the questions are still going to be the same.
Yes, the questions are very valid, and Jolene has a good point. I'm using narrative nonfiction because it's easy for us to show you the examples. How do the details work together? Great for anything cause and effect or anything compare and contrast. Why did the author choose this structure? Great for any type of expository structure because it gets you at the author's purpose for writing the chapter or the passage or whatever the author wrote. Moving on to the third kind, questioning the author. These might be my favorite because for students who are developing or struggling, it can give them an immediate sense of efficacy over a text that is difficult for them. So you can use these anytime you want to discuss or debate something about the author did, the author's purpose, etc. I like to use them to focus on layout, maps, charts, photos, headings. All of those things always require inference between the text feature and the body of the text. So, next slide, a questioning the author question, the same Carol story with a few text features. So read the story and work on the question, why does the author include the timeline? Yes, it definitely does help the reader understand the sequence of events. And that sequence of events is accurate with the text, right? The text and the timeline definitely go in order. Other answers in the chat? So, why does the author include the timeline? Basic inferences. When you told me it helps the reader understand the events, the timeline does illustrate the sequence of the text. They match up, but that is an inference. The timeline also matches the heading, Carol's first trip home. The heading matches the text and allows you to infer that the main idea is about Carol's first visit home with mom's son. So now the timeline is embellishing or giving me more information than I found in just the paragraph. The heading and the timeline work together to illustrate in pictures Carol's first trip home. But how do they work together? The author wants us to infer new information that embellishes and supports the narrative. Carol's coming home with mom's son, who is driving them home for college, and his car is blue. Carol may be the son's girlfriend, or not. Maybe she's just a friend. The title does say first trip home. The mother. It is the mother and her college-age son who work together regularly at the soup kitchen. Carol is also a college student, or college age. Carol drove the son's blue car to the store, and we can infer from the grocery cart that it was a grocery store as opposed to a convenience store in all likelihood. So again, what's happening here? Your proficient brain automatically determines many things about text features. This is especially true and really important because this is very discipline specific. How text features work in biology are going to be very different than the text features and types of text features that show up even in chemistry or in history. So your brain is inferring how the features support the body of the text, how they work together, how the heading and the timeline work together, and how they go with the text, which text features are the most important, and which are just nice. And I chose to give that to you in my question. I do that sometimes with students. You could ask which is the most important text feature. The timeline in this case is more important than the title. How to interpret images like charts, graphs, and maps, and how to interpret them in your subject area. If students can't do that, they can't infer how they work with the body of the text. And whether the text feature, a map, a timeline, provides the same information in a different format, or is providing extra supplemental information that may and or may not be critical to the content you're trying to get across. So again, we can't assume that readers who are developing expertise will make those same connections. They may not know how to interpret text features. They may not know how to determine how the author wants us to use the information, and they often skip text features or generate incorrect information from them. Another one of the things I do as a side gig is that I do SAT reading prep. And I have to train just about every student, regardless of proficiency, on how to read those charts and graphs and how to use them to connect to the text. They simply don't. They don't even look at them. And there is what's on your handout. Question starters, anything you want to talk about. Did the author give us a good heading? Does the author give me a good claim? What does the author want me to do with this pie chart? And you can use them anytime you want to discuss or debate, or I really like them with layout. And there are some examples from the slide. you could ask, does the author give us a good heading? Did the author answer his question? Doesn't belong there. My apologies. Did the author match the timeline, or how does the it should say, how does the author want us to use the timeline? And so you can find more about each question type in these two books. Reading for College is written for student readers learning how to handle nonfiction. The Landscape of Expository Comprehension is written for teachers and instructors to help with understanding how to create text-based critical questions. So what is special about Reading for College? I feel like it solves problems many other study skills books have. I taught a long time ago Reading 100, and the books that I was given to teach it at a community college were horrible. I am teaching one right now, and it has the same problem. It is written at a very high level. It jumps around. It does not give my students any sort of consistency in how to handle nonfiction text because it is written by topic. This book, Reading for College, moves the reader through each stage of the active reading process. From before reading and why you might be taking this class or why you might need this book, through how we bring prior knowledge and how we ask questions while we read. There are built-in scaffolds. So for every process, there is a simple, try this, with simple text like we just did with Carol. And then there is a more academic activity for students to do. The lens is not about deficits. It's not about filling deficits. It is about proficiency and helping students walk through their own thinking so that they can become proficient readers. And I was very careful when we were working on this to try and keep it around a 5th grade level. So the critical thinking is high, but the decodability is lower so that it should be accessible to all of your students. Jolene, do you want to say anything else about?
No, I mean, I was just going to talk about how we wrote it in a positive, encouraging tone and a very conversational tone. I found in writing my textbook, First Things First, that writing it in a easily decodable, as you say, tone and language, but really making it sound like I was talking, like I was giving a presentation in class, helped my students to decode and understand the higher level concepts because they were familiar already with the language patterns.
Oh, I have to click back in. And that is all we have today. I hope we have a little bit of time for answering questions. There is information. There's our contact information. And Bailey, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you both very much. And yes, we are open now for any questions. Feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A functions.
Yeah, I think Bailey and will be sending out links for the books.
Yep, looks like we have a question for the book link. And after the webinar, you will be directed to both book titles, and then we'll also be sending follow-up emails. As a reminder, this webinar was recorded, so you'll be receiving that in the coming days, as well as access to request a free faculty review copy and the presenter's information. All right, looks like that's all of our questions. Thank you again, everyone, for attending, and have a good rest of your evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.